All right. Well, welcome everybody. I'm really happy that you guys joined in, and I get to tell you all about Jurgen Habermas' theory of communicative action. First of all, about the sources, I made a point of gathering all the sources that I got for the presentation. There will be a sources page at the end that will relate the individual sources to the specific page of the presentation as well. So you don't have to worry at all about that. If there's any gaps in there, please ask me afterwards, and I can maybe alleviate that problem, any problems that might be there. Unfortunately, they are the German sources because my master thesis is in German as well. The quotes are also translated. I did not have the time to go into the English official translations of Habermas's works. So obviously there's like at least a little bit of risk there, because with theory, we all know that translations are always also already interpretations. Nevertheless, if anyone needed sources for this reconstruction of mine, these sources would be correct regardless of their language. And for a more in-depth reconstruction, I can provide you with my master thesis as well, which is also German. But it is also set to be published by my university's library soon. So if you want, just text me and I can give you that as well. All right, so starting. Habermas is likely the most important German philosopher of the 20th century and until today. Alongside John Rawls and Michel Foucault, he is probably one of the most influential postmodern philosophers worldwide. I value his theory for the comprehensive explanation of the structures of modern societies and for a relatively reliable concept of rationality. Although obviously there are many legitimate critiques of Habermas, some of which I indulge in too, that is not my topic today. I will be happy, and I'm actually looking forward to critiques and questions that we can discuss afterwards. So I divide his theory into 5 parts, which also has the added benefit that if I can't get through all of his theory, which I try to comprimate, but it might just end up the way that I need to stop after Habermas 3, and will then start looking for a next option when we can continue with it. But those are likely possible points of exit for us starting the discussion of what I conveyed. So for the first part, his theory of action is kind of the groundworks. And one category he has there is the category of teleological action, also goal-oriented action. And here he has 2 subcategories. One is instrumental action, which means acting on material object. For instance, you fell a tree to be able to transport it, or you use an instrument to produce a sound. This is really just restricted to the physical. And then he has the category of strategic action, which is defined as acting on people, not with people. We will regard that after this page. And strategic action can be open or concealed. So open strategic action is functions via incentives and sanctions. If you do this and that action, I will give you money, for instance, or I will help you at another time as well. But there may also be concealed strategic action, like offering to help someone to gain control over them at a later point. I may or may not be aware that I'm acting concealedly strategic, but it is strategic nevertheless. Then the second and maybe more central category for Habermas's theory is Communicative action. It is obviously at the center. The main work is his main work is the Theory of Communicative Action, which he also calls mediation-oriented action. For Habermas, the goal of communicating with others instead of strategically causing desired actions goes beyond mere goal orientation. And this category forms the foundation, so to speak, of his whole theory. Fundamentally, speaking can be an action. Non-verbal communication is communication too. Unconscious communicative action is possible. Non-action is action as well. Actions may still be communicative if they take place long after the communication they originate from. So I make a promise, and when I keep the promise years later, that would still be communicative action that I'm indulging in. Communicative action always makes so-called validity claims. This is a Habermasian term. At least at first, it is assumed in communication that what is said is correct, or that one has correctly followed norms with one's action. Communicative types of action make validity claims over different facets of reality, so-called world references. In case of objections, mediation in discourses can take place in discourses or via critique. The first category here is the constitutive speech act. For instance, this could be the sentence, "The sky is blue." It is meant to express objective reality about the physical objective world. So these are truth claims, or these he calls truth claims. They can be mediated via theoretical discourse, which is, for instance, scientific endeavor. It could also be testing if that is really blue, if it is really blue, that hue of the sky at that moment, but usually it is modern science. The second category that I include here, because there are far more categories that I don't really have the time for right now, is dramaturgical action. This is meant to express subjective sensations and is making veracity claims over the subjective world of one's own experience. Therapeutic critique can be applied to mediate this, because the feeling of a person can ultimately only really be contradicted professionally. If somebody cries, we are forced to accept that the person is feeling like crying, feeling sad, for instance. And only a professional, therapeutic professional could really interpret anything further with any claim to rational validity. Next category I wanted to include here is the evaluative statement. This is meant to evaluate social appropriateness and thus makes appropriateness claims over the social world. And it can be mediated via aesthetic critique, because just like the preference for individual cultures and societies, for instance, those one is born into, the fit of any actions and the appropriateness of those actions in their social and cultural environment is ultimately a matter of taste. So this can only be critique. This can't really be a rational kind of discourse in the way that Habermas thinks about the term. One such statement may be, crucifixes in schools do not fit into our secular society. And now the last category of actions is the norm-oriented or norm-regulated action. It is meant to obey social norms, and it thus implies rightness claims over actions in the social world. So this isn't about physical truth, this is about social rightness. I am in the right if I obey those social norms, or I might be more in the right if I don't obey them because I have this and that this or that argument for my actions being more right. Practical discourse can be applied to mediate the rightness of action of practices, so that's why it's called practical discourse. And a norm-oriented actions may be something like men keeping doors open for women out of courtesy, supposedly, or on the other hand, refraining from posting sexist jokes on WhatsApp out of political correctness. Both of those are norm-oriented actions, They just have different norms they are following. And like I said, there are other action categories, but these are sufficient for an overview and for a basis for the further presentation. And with this, we can move on to the next part of Habermas's theory. And this is maybe the most famous, if not the most infamous one even. At least I have a feeling that the discourse ethics of Habermas are what is most known and what he is most known as, and are also the perspective through which most of his work is read. So he starts out because Habermas sees a problem for practical discourses in particular. In contrast to theoretical discourses about the material world, they have a far less tangible object, which is social norms. Searching a rational principle of universal consensus building, he initially starts out oriented on Kant's categorical imperative, which you have there. Act only according to that maxim, whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Now, from there out, he works out his own universalization principle, which is somewhat parallel for social norms, i.e. the condition. This is the condition of their general validity, general in the sense of socially general. Everybody, or like a large majority in any given social context, accepts this under these, or like calls this valid under these preconditions. So norms are only valid if the consequences and side effects for the satisfaction of the interests of each individual that probably result from general compliance with them can be accepted and preferred to the effects of known alternative options of regulation by all persons concerned. So the categorical imperative is there, but there's far more of a social perspective there. And it has to be actually concluded by everyone in a concrete practical discourse. This is where this is going towards, at least. Now, with his discourse ethics, Habermas also answers skeptics, philosophical opponents questioning the possibility of general rational social norms in general, i.e. non-cognitivism. In his reasoning, he constructs a consequent skeptic who tries to refute the discourse ethic by all means. Before Habermas, the skeptics had formulated the so-called Munchausen trilemma, which was long regarded as a triumph on their part. In one scene from the Baron Munchausen stories, he claims that he pulled himself out of the swamp by his own hair. This is also how the trilemma works. Every attempt to rational norms thereby, with reasons, thereby leads to either infinite regression, as in you shouldn't steal because you shouldn't take property away from others because you are not entitled to it, because you didn't work for it, because otherwise everyone will steal instead of work, because it's not a nice life, because you can't be sure of being a winner, and so forth. So it will always continue into the infinite, and you will never reach that grounding principle of this is why, this and that. It just always goes on. The other options is that this same process is just arbitrarily abandoned. So it's you shouldn't steal because God says so. And that's where it stops. It's just like claimed at this point that this is the ground, the basis, and that's it. And the third option is circular reasoning. For instance, if somebody asks, why shouldn't refugees stay in Germany? Someone might answer because they don't work. And why don't they work? Because they are not citizens, so they don't have to have a work permit. Why are they not citizens? Because they shouldn't stay in Germany. So this is this circular kind of reasoning. So in the end, the Munchausen trilemma posits that there's just no possibility of rationally arriving at any rational discussion of social norms. However, Habermas has an answer to that, which is the performative contradiction. And this is an argumentative figure that Apel, Hans Otto Apel, also applied before him. They kind of worked together, and he kind of expanded on Apel's work before him. The trilemma is an argument. The skeptics have long since implicitly agreed to clarify the validity of standards by giving reasons. Whoever argues at all, though, thus implies the acceptance of the necessary preconditions for the argument. So the Munchausen trilemma is not strategic action. It is communicative. It is implicitly oriented on the possibility of being discussed with reasons, with arguments. And therefore, it already stands on the basis of certain preconditions of the argument as a concept itself. From here, Habermas and Apel draw an entire catalog of preconditions of arguments. Things that need to be assured for something to be an argument. And this dynamic between him and the skeptic that he constructs kind of goes forth from here. Next, he has the skeptic want to refrain from acting norm-oriented as a whole in order to escape the rational validity of norms. However, then he says, all communicative action implies mutual recognition of norms, at least communicative rather than goal-oriented action. Then the skeptic only wants to act in a goal-oriented manner anymore, but that would be pathological according to Habermas. And in the ultimate consequence, the skeptic draws, he completely wants to completely avoid interaction with others, but Habermas calls this also psychologically harmful, but above all not particularly attractive for most people. So this way he kind of surrounds the skeptic argument with his idea that there is just not a really practically feasible way to not act norm-oriented ever and to be completely objectivist in one's actions. So the whole catalog of requirements for actual arguments taking place can be converted into rules for ideal argumentation, the so-called ideal speech situation, which acts as a point of orientation for practical discourses. And this is, at least as I have witnessed it, maybe the most infamous concept from Habermas's theory. And it is really important, because that isn't always done, to note that the ideal speech situation is an ideal, and Habermas is very aware of the fact that it is unlikely, if not impossible, to actually arrive at the ideal speech situation. The way he intends it to be used is as a telos, which all speech situations, non-ideal as they may be, can be oriented and evaluated. So the further away you are from the ideal speech situation, the fewer of these rules are followed in any given context, the less ideal the speech situation is, and the more likely it is that there's power at work, and that it is actually not actually a rational discourse that is taking place, but one that is subverted by strategic motives. These discourse rules, I have summarized some of those I find most important and most exemplary. The first one is no speaker may contradict themselves. Whoever contradicts themselves has argued badly, and that does not really meet this requirement for good reasoning. Each speaker may only claim what they themselves believe. An assertion in which you do not believe yourself is deception, i.e. no longer communicative action, but oriented towards a certain goal which makes you say something you don't actually believe in. Every being capable of speech and action may participate in discourses. With every subject or every criticism and every claim that discourses are lacking, they lack perspectives that test the rational quality of the given reasons. So everyone needs to be actually included. Anyone may call any claim into question. This is the very same thing. All things need to be able to be criticized, or everything needs to be able to be claimed. Then the last rule, and this might be the most central one, excuse me. No speaker may be hindered from exercising the above rights through coercion within or outside of the discourse. Exclusion runs the risk that something other than the coercion of the better argument will distort consensus. The unforced force of the better argument is the general term used here. So if there's any other kind of social pressure or actual exclusion or discrimination, that would be in the way of the rationality of the discourse there. And that would not be the unforced force of the better argument. So only better reasons can really count in ideal discourse. From here, Habermas arrives at his discourse ethical principle. Only norms that have received or could receive the approval of all concerned persons as participants of a practical discourse may claim validity. This implies also a potentially limitless number of participants. So children, future generations, criminals, people with mental disabilities, people who, for whatever reason, may not be able of communicating verbally, for instance. Everyone needs to be included because every single individual perspective is needed to assure that the discussed claims and the consensus that the group may arrive at is really universally valid. In principle, even philosophers may not enjoy privileges of participation in discourses because of the relative disadvantage of others, because a non-equal participation would also spell out a sort of exclusion of less professional opinions and perspectives. As experts, they certainly can, but like philosophers certainly can indulge in discourses as well, but this will always be a problematic authority for Habermas. Now, that is all for discourse ethics, and we can move on to the life word, the third part of his theory. The life word is a very central concept for Habermas and other philosophers as well that he in part relies on. For Habermas, the life word is just the background of interpersonal action. It serves as a kind of storage for previously accepted validity claims. These can be assumed in communicative action and discourse and do not have to be problematized. They may also be viewed as self-evident and never have been questioned in discourse, instead having been passed on implicitly by previous generations. For instance, when discussing, we don't have to start from scratch every time, but can already assume a lot of mutual agreements. No one needs to be told what a cow is when we talk about animal rights, and we all have a similar idea about what a state is when we talk about police violence. But obviously these ideas of what a cow is, what a state is, can be caught into questions and then be their own validity claim that is caught into question in a discourse. But at the onset, the life word just holds all these pre-assumptions that we have, the pre-understanding, the non-problematized understandings of elements of our world, our life word. This can also include normative ideas that, for example, democracy is a good thing. The life word consists of three structural components: culture, society, and personality. These components are created and maintained through three corresponding aspects of all communicative actions. Culture is produced or reproduced by communicative action mediating interests while referring to, affirming, adapting, or replacing cultural values. For instance, by following etiquettes of politeness or establishing new ones. Society is reproduced by our coordination of actions, bringing us together, integrating us socially. For instance, statutory Christmas holidays. Personality is reproduced by communicative actions, socializing those involved and thus developing their personal identities. For example, schools, sports, and political activism can socialize persons, individual identities. And it's important to stress that while there may be more stress on one or another of these three aspects in any given communicative action context, they are always, all three of them, concerned. With every communicative action, each of these aspects is included and revised and reproduced. This reproduction of the life work that happens through communicative action in this way can work well or badly. Habermas names the following quality standards for each of the three. How helpful is cultural knowledge for accommodation towards communicative action? So this is the rationality of the knowledge bequeathed. It's just important how rational it is to actually be successful in communicative action. Communicative action can also be a challenge, a coordinative challenge, or like a physical challenge. And if our cultural knowledge isn't rational enough to actually help us deal with any given situation, then it isn't rational enough. The solidarity of members. Does social integration really bring about social cohesion? And then the accountability of persons socialized by the formation of identity. How accountable do people become through socialization for communicative action? Less accountable people are more difficult to deal with in communicative action. These components also mutually contribute to each other's preservation. Cultural worldviews can legitimize social or political orders. For instance, we culturally view democracy as positive and therefore consider it legitimate. I assume most people at least do. Conversely, social or political order often obliges people to adhere to cultural values. For instance, tax and pension policy may benefit traditional nuclear families of heterosexual spouses compared to others. So this kind of reproduction of the life world is definitely engaged in power relations as well. Habermas by no means says that it is always a moral good that happens here. It's just the way in which life worlds or societies try to strive for cohesion, and that is always involved in power relations as well. A social order can give people a social affiliation, for instance, as a humanistically raised child of two teachers. Thus, on the other hand, the child, the personality there, adapts a lifestyle that conforms to societal norms. For instance, working towards financial success. Something as mundane as that could be norm conformity in this view. Cultural worldviews open personalities, all of us, up to this education, for instance, through positive cultural attitudes towards education. Conversely, we use the received competence of applying knowledge to worldviews and thus reproduce them, for instance, by accepting or rejecting neoliberal ideology. In this way, the life world can also change with regards to its content. If cultural knowledge is no longer sufficient to conduct mediation, meaning is lost. If it is not rational enough anymore, for instance, what ideas of masculinity and femininity we have, then these concepts can gradually lose their meaning because they did not measure up to the challenges of the modern time, to new situations that need to be mastered by whatever group is acting communicatively with each other. Any courtesy etiquette may be questioned due to lack of rationality. They no longer make sense, so they also feel less meaningful. A lack of social cohesion, on the other hand, can lead to deviating social behavior that is anomaly or anomie. Graffiti could be an example. Everybody isn't recycling as they should, or people are driving their skateboards on the sidewalk, things like that. Anyone who is not socialized in a way that enables their participation in communicative action in a responsible manner may develop mental illness. This is only, he by no means says that this is the only source of mental illness, but obviously alienation and being a social outcast, so to speak, can cause mental illness as well. Under these conditions, then, the components stop supporting each other and instead undermine each other. Outdated cultural values can no longer legitimize social orders, and less orderly societies unsettle cultural values. Less orderly societies cannot offer people a fixed social affiliation, so they follow social norms less. People cannot orient themselves toward outdated cultural values and are therefore less inclined to continue cultural traditions. If communicative action fails because of this, validity claims are no longer affirmed. Cultural worldviews are no longer shared by everyone. This, decentralization of worldviews follows from this, and on the other hand can of course intensify loss of meaning, or be loss of meaning, and thus strengthen the narrative, the negative spiral for the life world, so to speak. However, we would also probably never have achieved a secular democratic society if religious and monarchist worldviews had never lost meaning and had never been decentralized. Breaks were needed so that the living world could change historically in terms of content. Habermas calls this process the rationalization of the life world. According to him, it started with the Reformation, but only really got going with the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And this is what we're going to regard next: rationalization of the life world. Because cultural values were less and less able to legitimize the existing social order, worldviews and institutions became more independent of each other, where before they were very intertwined. Monarchies, for instance, were legitimized by the idea of a divine mandate of Christian culture. After secularization, sovereigns had to legitimize themselves otherwise, through constitutions or democracy. Then also, due to greater diversity, there was an ever wider range of social affiliation, each with its own norms attached. In the past, one may simply have been the son of a blacksmith, and then likely became a blacksmith themselves. Today, I cannot try out 10 identities during my school years alone, for example, as a hip-hop fan, rocker, football player, video game professional, etc. People who are used to this can deal with discredited values more critically and adapt or replace them more innovatively. The value of traditional nuclear family, of a heterosexual couple can be replaced by the additional recognition of working women, as well as alternative family models, gender identities, and sexualities, without neglecting the rational value of the child's welfare. According to Habermas, this dynamic also means that there are certain perspectives for the reproductive processes of each aspect of the life world. For culture, this just means the constant reflection of revision of cultural values. We are now engaged far more in discussions about what a man and a woman is, and if these categories are even valid, than people were 100, 200 years before. And that is rationalization in this aspect. For society, the legitimacy of social orders may be constituted far more by formal positing of legal norms and justification of these norms. For instance, through parliaments, but maybe also just by a monarch saying them, because monarchies aren't anti-rationalization. They may just not have good chances long term in a context of rationalization. And then lastly, for personality, the constant stabilization of abstract identities. So, like I said, one isn't only anymore just a blacksmith, or being just a blacksmith may not be enough anymore in the way that it was before. You need more, and your identity becomes far more abstract than it used to be. It used to be way more materialistic in this way, according to Habermas. According to Habermas, this also means that the reproductive processes in the life world are specialized and professionalized and broken. The socialization of children was largely taken over by pedagogues at the latest when compulsory schooling is introduced. And this is happening at the height of life world rationalization, like around the turn of the century, turn of the 19th to the 20th century. In addition, also, people increasingly view their lifestyle as a method by which they maintain and expand their economic efficiency. So this is far more methodological. Democracy then increasingly served to legitimize social and political orders and roughly corresponds to a discursive decision-making process. Very roughly though. But like I said, monarchies can still be there in a rationalized life world, but they just have a far harder time to justify their legal bodies and their order. Lastly, Habermas divides cultural reproduction in a rationalized life world into 3 action systems. Firstly, artistic endeavors stop mainly working for the religious cult, as they did during the Middle Ages, for instance, during feudal societies, and develop independent aesthetic standards. So and thus they arrive at the autonomous value sphere of autonomous art. The scientific community separates from religious worldviews and finds causality instead of belief as its own epistemic principle. Many of the early scientists were professing Christians, and according to their understanding, explored the world that God gave them. And that stopped being a thing, so to speak. And yeah, atheism was started being a way bigger deal, and non-metaphysical causality became the name of the game, so to speak. And then lastly, the legal system also separates from religious norms. The religious community remains religious, but its actions are less based on the promise of salvation beyond the profane. Both are now instead based increasingly on increasingly systematic ethical principles. And thus 3 independent value spheres are created: the value sphere of autonomous art, that of modern science, and that of modern justice and moral conceptions. These are really abstract categories, but they are meant to describe how cultural understandings became rationalized, became less mystical, and thus also less, more autonomous from the life world, if you will. A society with a rationalized living environment has a big problem. The independent cultural action systems and the disparate social identities massively complicate their social integration. The various revolutionary movements of the 19th century underline that the survival of societies in their form at that time was indeed threatened. To remedy this, social orders increasingly used forms of so-called systemic integration instead of social integration of the life world. However, obviously nobody was sitting on a throne and made such a decision. These societies had problems integrating, and as in evolution, only those who found a new integration mechanism could survive in their form. So this is the end of Habermas 3 life world. It is now 1:45, so I think I might stop here unless you guys think it would be better for me to continue with the last 2 parts.
I think it's good to stop here and open for questions.
Yes.
Maybe I start my question first. Thank you for your presentation. I really like it. Can you go back to the part 1, the table about 4 types of validity?
Yes, give me a second here. Yes.
So I think it's a quite basic question, but I want to ask, what's the difference between appropriateness and rightness?
Yes, I kind of anticipated that question because it is a really fine line between those. So a norm-oriented action would regard a certain norm that it is trying to follow, or multiple norms, just as correct as they are, and that's the validity claim. And then they follow that that norm. they are really interested in the norm itself. Like, does it make sense internally? And that's the way a practical discourse may address a norm as well. Like, is it logically feasible? And evaluative statement, on the other hand, is just concerned with the appropriateness. So it's not, is this a rational universal norm, but it is more like, this norm is one that is fitting for our society. Like I said, like a secular society, there might have norms, you know, precluding crucifixes in classrooms or other religious symbols in government agencies. And that is a matter of appropriateness. If, on the other hand, someone were to question the normative legitimacy of religious symbols in any state agency, no matter which specific culture it belongs to, that is a question of rightness, not of appropriateness.
Okay, thank you. So it's about whether it's kind of a universal or kind of a narrow, small group.
Yeah. Appropriateness is more about the fittingness of any action, of any norm for the culture it is in. And rightness is far more universal, is like all human society.
I have another question. So in your, can I go to the slide on life world change part?
That one or the next one?
I think next one, maybe. Oh, actually, it's similar. So a previous one. I'm thinking about, okay, so imagine there is a social deviator. There's this one single social deviator. So what will he or she end up with? So will he be kind of treated as a psychopath and be abandoned by society, or he will have a chance to change the social norms?
Well, that depends entirely on the specific context. For one, I think one thing that can happen, and that is an interesting combination with maybe like a Foucaultian perspective, is that because of his or her anomaly, his deviation, he might be ascribed a psychopathology. And that is really interesting, because that might happen as well, a measure to prevent more anomaly by the social order. But on the other hand, what Habermas actually means is the mere fact of being, of deviating, of being anomal, and not normal for the society you're in, might lead to actual psychopathology. So that's alienation is something that this person would end up with, and they would have a far harder time to orient themselves and their actions to anything, because the alienation leads to a lack of motivation to follow normative orders, but then the individual is also left without any specific orientation if they do not recognize the cultural values anymore. And thus this person would not follow cultural traditions. They would not engage in, you know, those activities as often, and would be even more alienated and removed from the society. And whether they themselves can change anything, well, that isn't really a level on which Habermas's theory operates. In theory, ideally, discourse would provide them with the opportunity to bring forth their arguments against the social order and the cultural values. And if their arguments are good, then certainly that would lead to cultural change, because those cultural values and that order would then be discredited, not rational anymore, and everybody would be convinced that they should change. But Habermas knows, and we all know, that this isn't usually what happens. So yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. I'm not sure if this this kind of view helps, but there you go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, anyone else have questions? Oh, I think we have a question in the group chat.
Yes, yes. And that's a tough one, elaborating on the differences between Habermas and Foucault. That's really hard. Well, first of all, post-structuralist theories and like Foucault and Foucaultians in particular have a very large bone to pick with everything Habermas, because it's just so positive, you know. The idea that, you know, this ideal discourse is maybe not something that could be actually concretely achieved, but by just orienting our communication towards it as much as we can, step by step, we will arrive at a point where we are actually all equal. There are no power relations in play anymore, and thus our discourse and the consensus we arrive at is actually rational. That is really problematic from a Foucaultian perspective, because, you know, these consensus are can be viewed, and this is really problematic because I'm not that deep into Foucault, but can be viewed as discursive formations, as dispositive, and then have themselves a great deal of, develop a great deal of power just by the idea, the image of their validity, of their rationality. And that makes them less questionable. I mean, Habermas says everything should always be able to be questioned, but it's easy for him to write that, but it's far, far less easy for societies to actually build themselves this way. So that is, I think, a perspective of critique that often is done by Foucaultians, and rightly so. On the other hand, I also always find it interesting because these discourse concepts they have are very different on the one hand, but on the other hand, they can also be viewed as two sides of the same medallion, of the same coin. That's what it is. Because yeah, Foucault is concerned with their power dynamics, you know, and in a way Habermas does this as well. Like everything he talks about in rationalization and later in the subsystems as well, which we didn't get to today, the colonization thesis and everything, is really goes in towards the direction of least of questions of power and questions of subjugation. And he is peripherally aware of these issues, but he's just not as interested in them. He's more interested in how cultural movement, how rationalization can have us arrive at the point where, on the one hand, it is far more possible for colonization to happen, and which unfortunately I didn't get to explain, for subsystems like the market economy and the state to develop and exude power over the life world and everyone, us, therein. But on the other hand, rationalization, according to Habermas, leaves us at a place where it is more and more obvious that the actual source of rational validity of anything is discourse, is communication, is life word communication without the influence of subsystems. And that is his implicit hope for, I don't want to say revolution, but emancipation, in the way where the societies are so free of subsystemic structures that they can be actually rational. Their discourses can actually be free of power relations. And I think that's the key difference. Foucault is far more interested in deconstructing, difficult term for him, in criticizing and questioning power, and Habermas is very, very interested in a way out of that problem, so to speak. And I think it is valid to say that he is going a little too fast, and that he's not really concerning himself with the problems in his theory and the power relations he implies, without really addressing them. Yeah. Yes. But in my master thesis, I also arrived at a point where the colonization dynamics were just the other side of a panoptic structure in the internet. That is far more difficult to explain though. All right. Yeah, you're welcome, and no problem about that. Thomas, did you want to ask something, or?
Oh, sure. Thank you for the nice presentation. I think that was so awesome.
Thank you very much.
And it's really difficult covering Habermas because it's quite intensive. I would like to ask, how can you read Habermas in the context of racial identity? Because using rationality, rationalization in a socially disruptive world that is divided by racial tension, how can we contextualize Habermas communicative theory?
Yeah. I think that is really interesting also with Esther, regarding Esther's question, because this is exactly one of the places where, you know, he just doesn't concern himself a lot with the specifics of what power relations in discourse may be, what discrimination may be concretely, you know, in detail. Like racial discrimination and racism, they are there, you know, but they are in brackets, you know. He just says, that shouldn't happen. Discrimination, exclusion from discourse, it shouldn't happen, period. And that's where he leaves it at. So he doesn't write a lot about how that could be done. He just writes about how wrong it is if it is done. And I mean, that can be considered useful, but on the other hand, also, like, it is his privilege, obviously, as, you know, a Western white male, to just say, yeah, all of that stuff, all of that discrimination stuff, it's just illegitimate. Don't do it. And that's the extent of how much he engages with it and has to engage with it because of his privilege.
So could we say Habermas in his critical theory was trying to prove the power of rationalization in creating social change, but yet himself was not so much convicted as to come out straight with his stance on racial identity, but yet because he was trying to follow the status quo?
I am not as secure about his performance as a researcher and as a political figure, so I don't know entirely, but yes, like the direction of what you're saying, I think is correct. Like, he concerned himself far more with way more abstract categories, way more abstract questions about the possibility of non-normative rationality at all. You know, he replied to his theoretical adversaries, and you know, this is the struggle he dedicated himself to. But he didn't really, from what he wrote normatively, go into the practical, you know, yeah, into practical matters, into actually combating racial prejudices and barriers to discourse or to just societal inclusion.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think because of time limit, we probably will close this session. Thank you very much, Jendrik, for this very insightful and interesting discussion. And I'm very looking forward to the second part. I hope this will not come very late. So thank you, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you, guys.